Welcome to the HR Think Tank, a podcast that uncovers the power a trusted workforce has on team performance, culture, and morale. We gather insights from experts, business leaders, and HR professionals to help you lead your team. Here's your host, Kai No, CEO and co-founder of Verify Now.
Trust is an essential ingredient for healthy and prosperous relationships, and certainly one of the key themes of this podcast. On today's episode, we discuss the neuroscience of conversation and its role in building trust in the workplace. We also explore what it means to have a high-value creating team. How do you build such a team? What are the competitive advantages and why should organizations care? Our guest today is Sarit Vandergraaff, a highly experienced organizational coach and facilitator who has worked with leaders from a cross-section of industries here in Australia and abroad. Sarit is certified in conversational intelligence and a professional certified coach with the International Coaching Federation. Welcome to the show, Sarit.
Hi, Kai. It's lovely to be here.
So I want to get straight into the topic. Help us understand, what is a high-value creating team?
A high-value creating team is a term coined by Professor Peter Hawkins. Peter Hawkins is a professor at the leadership professor at Henley Business School in the UK. And he's done a lot of work around team development, what makes a team high performing and high value creating. And what he found was that quite often when we're looking at teams, we're looking at the team on its own, as its own entity. So a high performing team is often very inward looking. You've got highly successful individuals working together, sometimes towards a shared goal. A high value creating team is where we are working as a team with and for our stakeholders. So we are working within an ecosystem which includes stakeholders, the organisation, and the individuals. What are we here to actually do as a team? What is our purpose and our commission as a team to create?
What would you say are the differences from a communication and accountability perspective between, say, a high-value creating team and an average team?
One of the big differences is that when you're looking at team performance and they have great team meetings, for example, and everyone feels motivated and excited. An average team would then walk away from that team meeting, become the head of whatever department that they're the head of, and then they have their own communication style and represent themselves. From a high value creating team, what happens after those great team meetings is that we are actually representing the brand of the team in everything that we do. So it's easy to be high performing and have great conversations as a team. But what happens after we have those team interactions, when we are not together with our team, but we are actually out there in the organisation, in the ecosystem, with our own separate teams in terms of, the communication and passing on a united front message. Yeah. So that's one aspect of a high value creating team that's different.
And I guess before we move on to providing some, insights into building such a team, why should organizations strive to have high value creating teams?
I guess the answer is in the value. All organizations, whether it's in the for-purpose sector or in the corporate sector, we are creating value for our customers and our clients. We want our teams then, of course, to create value so that we can pass on that value to our customers and our clients. It just sets the environment up for better working relationships, clarity of process and task. We are learning together and growing together as a team. And then, of course, everyone else benefits. So really the answer is in the word value.
Just on the high value creating team, how do you make it sustainable? Because is there a risk that when you're operating at that level, there is a greater degree of burnout? How do you ensure as a business leader or as a team leader that you can sustain that energy level?
I would say it's quite the contrary. I think that actually it's more nourishing than the suggested burnout. People, might associate it with really hard work, and there's a bit of a badge of honor around working really long hours and so forth. But a high value creating team will be very balanced. There'll be a lot of co-creation with each other. a nourishment of each other. There's definitely a lot of mutual support and role modeling, effective role modeling, which would ensure that people aren't burning out. In terms of sustainability, once you get into the operating rhythm of the team, and once you contract as a team as to what are some of the behaviours and the values that we are embracing as a team, and they will be connected to our purpose as a team, then everyone understands what their roles are, and we're contracting, so everyone is accountable for this co-created contract. And so no one is going to do any more or less than another person in terms of the essence of the team itself.
Can you tell us more about the neuroscience of conversations?
Absolutely. One of my big passion in life, as you mentioned earlier on, I'm certified in conversational intelligence. And this is the work of Judith E. Glaser, who unfortunately has passed away. But I've had the absolute privilege and honour to be learning with her when I was getting certified. And she does call it the neuroscience of conversation. And that comes from the fact that all of our conversations, small or big, with anybody that we come across, are chemical in nature. They might raise and upregulate a chemical called cortisol, which is our stress chemical. And when our brain's flooded with cortisol, we feel stressed and overwhelmed. We might walk away from that conversation with a negative experience coming from fear. Some conversations raise a chemical called oxytocin, which is our bonding chemical. I think today, Kai, you and I have loads of oxytocin between us as we are connecting and talking to each other. Why is that important? And of course, there's a lot of other chemicals in the brain that come into play. The reason why that's important is that in order to be at our most creative, at our most productive, at our most innovative, and at our most trusting, we need to have a prefrontal cortex engaged, which is the front of our brain. A lot of people call it the executive brain. If we are coming from a place of fear, we are engaging the primitive brain, which is at the back of the brain. And that part of the brain hasn't changed very much since we were cavemen, so that's the same. If we're engaging from that part of our brain, our conversations will be based on fear, and low trust lives in the primitive brain. So the role of trust is very important because it actually changes our reality. Judith spoke about trust changing our reality, and a little bit of an example of that would be that if I'm receiving some feedback from two different people, one person I trust implicitly is in my corner, and that feedback that they're giving me would then be taken as a source of development and opportunity for growth. The next person might be giving me the exact same feedback in the same tone, but if the trust is low, then I will take their feedback as an attack, as something that I'm taking personally, potentially even as an insult. So they would have given me the feedback in exactly the same way, but one I would take as an opportunity for growth and one I would take as an attack. And the only difference is trust. So when we take that into an organization or even into leadership, the role of trust is really important. Of course, as a leader and as an organization, I want my people to be productive and innovative and engaged and creative, and trust to take some risks and experiment and make decisions. But I can only do that if they feel that there's psychological safety, and if they trust that if there's, for example, failure, that it will be an opportunity for learning as opposed to a blame or a judgment experience. And so as a leader, I want to ensure that I build trust with my people, so that they are at the best versions of themselves.
You know, obviously trust takes time, it takes effort. Well, this is specifically for leaders. What are the key actions they can take every day with their team to help foster that trust?
First of all, number one is build rapport. You know, we have to connect with people. And building rapport is not just, hi, how you going? Building rapport is about thinking of the environment that we're in. You know, are we going to have a cup of coffee, for example, outside of the office? Am I taking interest in your family, in your everyday life? Do I actually know what motivates you and what inspires you to do really good work? So knowing your team and building rapport is, the first foundational level. But that's not enough. The next step would be to actually be consistent in how I show up as a leader. If I say that I'm going to do something and then I follow up with that action, then that builds trust. People trust that I will complete the task that I said I will be doing. But it's not just about that. It's also about how I show up in terms of my emotional intelligence and my social intelligence. What happens to me under stress? And how do I show up under stress when I'm overwhelmed as a leader? Does it mean that I take it out on my people? Does it mean that I shut down? Do they need to walk on eggshells because they don't know in what mood I'm going to be in on any particular day? So that self-reflection and self-awareness is key in leadership in terms of building trust. And of course, it's things like confidentiality. I've come across leaders who were very lovely, very charismatic, very social, but they couldn't keep confidentialities. And that's a massive trust issue. There's a wonderful Dutch proverb that I came across through a colleague that says that trust lives on horseback and comes back on foot.
That makes sense.
It makes sense, right? So
because it takes a long time to build. But if you haven't got strong foundations, it doesn't take a lot to lose it either.
Exactly. And then it's a lot longer to build it back. One of the analogies that I use is the trust bank account, essentially. And that is that we need to make deposits, right? So we make deposits of, trust and relationship and so forth. Now, if I've got enough of a savings plan there as a leader, then and I make little withdrawals, it's not going to be felt because the trust is there. I know that you might have said something you didn't mean, but it doesn't happen very often and you must have been under stress. So I still trust you overall because I know that overall you are a great leader that I have a great relationship with. But if I haven't made enough of those deposits and I make that withdrawal, then it's a lot harder for me to recoup and get back into that trusting relationship and that rapport.
That's a great point. If you don't mind, I'm going to pull on this thread a little bit more. So, when we talk about having a safe working environment, people often think about the physical aspects. Mm-hmm. Now, 2020 was one of those years where there was a lot of uncertainty. So I'm sure there were lots of people who felt vulnerable at different times during that year, and it continues into this year. How do you create psychological safety?
Psychological safety is something that's talked about a lot, as you said, over the last year, but certainly over the last sort of 5 years, it's really come up to the surface. And it's a term that's thrown around a fair bit. And I do think that it's not really very much understood. Psychological safety, a lot of people think it's about, just about the culture in terms of having good relationships. And a lot of organizations have, great cultures on the surface. We have bowls of fruit in the kitchen and tea and coffee in the kitchen, and we have functions and we really like each other as people. But psychological safety is much deeper than that. People need to feel safe to make mistakes. People need to feel safe that from those failures and mistakes, which are actually how we learn and grow, they will be able to learn and grow, and that the culture of the organisation enables that and encourages that. What I find in a lot of organisations is that people are afraid to make decisions because they don't feel psychologically safe to make those decisions. So rather than make those decisions, they either procrastinate or they will come to somebody else, they will approach somebody else to make the decision for them, so that when push comes to shove, they can then point the finger at someone else. And of course, that's very, very unhealthy. Of course, again, that prefrontal cortex is where psychological safety lives. And again, that relies on trust. And so if trust exists and if there's a culture of trust within the organisation, then I know that I'm safe to make those mistakes. Not just from a mistakes perspective, I'm also safe to speak up. It's candor without consequence. am I able to come up to my leader or even my leader's leader and say, hey, something isn't right here. I want to call something out. I want to call a behavior, or I want to speak up and let you know that I don't think this particular project is going to work, without feeling a sense of fear when I do that. So I think, how do you know you've got a psychologically safe organization is if people are actually candid and they're not afraid to speak up in a very respectful way, and they do it for the organization and more importantly for stakeholders, then I think that's a really good measure that psychological safety is alive and well in the organization.
I want to move on to talking about the how you create a high value creating team. Now, we've touched on it bits and pieces throughout this conversation, but the first question I want to talk to you about is, how does this change now? Because we've got businesses that work in an all physical environment. Some are coming back to an all physical environment. There are a lot that still have a hybrid workforce, and then some just stick where they're dispersed, remote work from home approach. How does fostering trust change when you've got these different types of teams?
Every organization will be very different. Some organizations will be much more inclined to come back into the office and work physically together. Some organizations will say, hey, you know what? We've just established working from home. It's working great. Let's just keep doing that. And as you said, some organizations will want to have a combination of the two. A lot of it will depend on our clientele and the line of work that we're doing and whether that's suitable. And so it really needs to be organization-centric as well as people-centric. So, when COVID hit, it was very much about individuals, empathy, and making sure that people were okay. We didn't have a choice. Everyone had to go and work from home. And so as leaders, we had to make sure that people were okay, they were set up fine, and that we were checking in with them. So it was very much focused on the individual. As time went on and we realized that things are changing, we had a little bit more choice. But people were actually potentially enjoying working from home. They're saving travel time, and they can go and pick up the kids and exercise and all those other things that were great for them. And also that the other paradox is that, that basket of washing is still staring at me in the face, and I might be distracted by some of those household things. And so we needed to then think about, as leaders, not just about the individuals, but also about the organization. What's best for the organization from a productivity perspective, as well as the well-being of the individual. So if we go back to high value creating teams, if we just look at that model by Professor Peter Hawkins, he has the 5 disciplines of high value creating teams. And I won't go through it in detail, but he makes a very good point. A lot of times when we're looking at teams and establishing great teams, we look at team dynamics, and we very much focus on that team bonding side of things. So we have, away from office days where, we have offsites and things like that. And they're amazing. They're absolutely necessary for team bonding. But a lot of times that's where it stops, and it's not enough. There needs to be a systemic lens that is applied to this if we're going to be high value creating within the ecosystem that we're in. So he talks about the fact that stakeholder lens comes in, and stakeholders are the ones who are commissioning the team to do the work. So why do we even exist as a team, and what is our purpose comes from a stakeholder. So it's very much outside looking in. So that's a bit of a commissioning phase. There needs to be a bit of a clarifying phase in terms of task. What is my role? What's my job description? How do I make decisions? Who makes the decisions? Who is even a member of this team? All of those questions and answers that need to happen that are part of high value creating teams. And another facet of that is, how do we represent the team to the outside world, which we touched on before. The last one is how we learn and grow as a team. So that's really about the sum of all parts. We are here. We're going to try things out. We're going to be experimenting. Some things will work and some things will not work. How do we learn from it as a team, not just as individuals, but as a team to create something bigger than what it actually is. So in terms of kind of a high value creative team, that's the model. And it's, as you can see, it's systemic, and it involves the whole organization and the ecosystem. If we're looking now, if we put that on to something like hybrid working environment or just office and just at home, we can't ignore that.
Yeah.
So we need to then, in the clarifying phase, that would be something that we would spend time on in terms of who works from home, when, how often, when do we come into the office, under what circumstances. Someone mentioned in one of the webinars that I was facilitating that on the days where everyone, so they do have a day where everyone comes in the office, but they kept it as a regular day. So people come into the office and then they just do the work. And one of her biggest realizations was that actually when we're all in the office, we need to be a bit more intentional and conscious about what we do. So rather than going from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting, which is what we used to do on a daily basis when we were all in the office, we need to set time aside to reconnect and be really intentional about that. This can't be the same as what it used to be. We need to change with what's happened in the ecosystem that we're working within.
Let's talk about the difference between a leader and a manager. What does that mean to you?
I talk to a lot of people about that. I ask them actually, what's the difference between a manager and a leader? A lot of leaders that I come across definitely show up more as managers. Management is a very important function in leadership. So let's get that out of the way. We have to be good managers to be good leaders as well. But management is really more around the administrative part of leadership. So it's about resources. It's about making sure that the right people are in the right place. It's about making sure that there are policies and procedures and processes available and there's role clarity. So we're managing our resources well. And again, important function of leadership. Leadership is more about the people. So it's really about how am I inspiring my people and motivating and engaging them to do the work. And so it's more of an overarching role. Leaders need to be self-aware. They need to understand how they're showing up. They need to understand the impact that they have on their people. And they can't just lead. So there's a really great article, which I think is by the HBR, the Harvard Business Review, and it's really about over-led, under-managed, or over-managed, under-led organizations. And what the differences are. Because if we only have leadership without management, people are confused. They don't understand what is expected of them. They don't understand what their roles are. So they might be inspired, but they won't really know what they have to do.
It's chaos.
It's chaos. Exactly right. Great word.
Yeah, and some people thrive in that while others don't. And organizationally,
Exactly.
I think it's quite challenging.
Very
if
much
you're
so.
operating in chaos all the time.
Very much so. The balance really is that we need to work within a particular container. There needs to be some boundaries in which we can have that autonomy and chaos. Chaos is not bad if it's within a boundary and a container. If I know what the expectations are, if I know what the organisation is trying to achieve, if I know what my stakeholders are looking for, if I'm really clear how I fit in, then I can then be creative and experiment and do all those amazing fun things as well of leadership as well. So we really need a balance between the creativity and the autonomy, but also the clarification and the boundaries.
Leadership is not easy. It requires a lot of effort. Some people say it's mostly nurture and some parts nature. I dare say it's even more important when you're leading a high value creating team, or if you want to lead a high value creating team. I know that you're a passionate advocate for equipping leaders with the tools to lead strategically and effectively with people at the front and center of their leadership. As a team coach and facilitator, you've achieved this using self-reflection, peer-to-peer learning, and self-awareness amongst leaders through dynamic questioning and idea generation. Why is it important for leaders to have a high degree of self-awareness and the ability for self-reflection?
Leadership is really about how you show up. It's a privilege. A lot of leaders don't realise how much impact they have on their people, not just at work, but also outside of work. As leaders, we impact people's lives, and that's the reality of it. I heard someone say before that, people watch you 24 24/7 in a sense when you're there, and they talk about you when you're not there as a leader. So there's a massive amount of impact. The way you show up as a leader then has impact on other people. So self-awareness is key, because only through knowing myself in terms of my self-knowledge, things like what drives me, what motivates me, but also what triggers me, what might cause me to behave in a way that I'm not proud of. So being really self-aware around my own kind of what's going on for me, and then being aware, and that's where social intelligence comes into it, being aware of what's going on for other people when they're coming into the workplace. So you have to start from self-awareness. That's kind of the foundation of leadership. And that takes a lot of self-reflection, which for many leaders is not a comfortable thing to do, especially when there are areas that you don't really want to tackle or address. I often talk about shining the torch in the dark corners. That's a lovely term that's used a lot by my colleague Karen Barker, who's the founder of TranExec. And it really is like that. You really need to shine the torch in the dark corners to kind of have a look at what's lurking there and what do I need to really reflect on and work on. So by working on myself, I can be the best version of the leader that I want to be for my people. And also it will encourage them to do the same. So as I'm role modeling those great behaviours and the values, they learn from that and they take on from that and they become their own leaders. So leadership is not about just leading other people. It's about leading myself first and foremost, and then leading others. And that could be my direct reports, it could be my colleagues, and it could include my own leader as well. So it doesn't stop there. It's an all-encompassing approach.
So you talked about, the need to look inward, the need to really reflect and work on yourself first. There was a study in 2014 from Timothy Wilson, a psychology professor from the University of Virginia, and colleagues from the same university plus Harvard University, that found participants typically did not enjoy spending 6 to 15 minutes in a room by themselves with nothing to do but think. That they enjoyed doing mundane external activities much more, and that many preferred to administer electric shocks to themselves instead of being left alone with their own thoughts. Most people seem to prefer to be doing something rather than nothing, even if that something is negative. So if you're new to leadership, you're stepping into a leadership role, in your experience as an executive and leadership coach, what are some simple actions these new leaders can take to begin their journey of self-reflection and self-awareness?
Lovely question. So just to go back onto the article, I couldn't agree more. As a coach, of course, I coach many individuals who are leaders. That's where I work. And quite often when people come to me with areas that they want to work on, they're normally external areas. So somebody else that they need to have a better relationship with, or a task, or it's somebody else's fault and they're impacting on them. Of course, where we often go to and where it ends up is what's going on for them. And they need to look inward in terms of what they're contributing to the situation. And so that already gives you this clue that people do prefer to look externally first before they'll look internally, because it's easier. It's much easier for me to say someone did this to me, as opposed to, hang on, what was within my control and my sphere of influence? So that's where the hard work comes into play. So, one of the suggestions that I have is mindfulness practice, which just allows you to calm down and sit with your own thoughts. This may or may not be easy for different individuals. There are a lot of apps that can be downloaded if people need a more guided way of being more mindful. I would highly recommend it, getting a coach. Some people are very good at coaching themselves and sitting with their own reflections. But a really good coach will provide a really safe environment in which to challenge your own self and really ask those thought-provoking questions whilst the trust is very high. So a good coach will know when to push and when to just leave things be. And that's what happens often in the coaching interaction. So I think if you really want to commit to growing as a leader, and to really do that self-work to be the best version of yourself, then employing a really good coach to help you with that self-reflection. Other ways of doing that is, of course, journaling. Judith E. Glaser, very much an advocate of journaling your thoughts. Again, for some people, it's not their thing, So journaling is wonderful, and that could include drawing. It doesn't have to be writing things down. Some people might prefer to record their thoughts on their iPhone and then listen back on that. And other things which are more external are things like, listening to podcasts and, TED Talks, and then, doing some of those exercise, reading books. There's a wonderful book called Positive Intelligence by, now I'm hoping I'm going to pronounce the name properly, but it's Shahzad Chaminade. I think some people call him Shamine, so I apologise if I'm mispronouncing the name. But he has a step-by-step ability to look at your internal saboteurs, those critics that come through and the different types, and it allows you to write it for yourself within a step-by-step process. So getting one of those sort of books that, it's kind of like almost like a workbook that allows you to work through that reflection process. So everyone's different.
Yeah. And I can imagine if you want to lead a high value creating team, you've got to have these under your belt. You've got to have the ability to self-reflect. You've got to have the courage to confront some of these thoughts as well, right? Because you want to evolve with your team.
Absolutely.
So I really enjoyed this conversation. I think we've talked about so many big topics. And before we wrap up, Sarit, we've got the Fast 5 questions. They're short and sharp responses. Are you ready?
Absolutely.
What was your first job?
Customer service in a shop called Stacks Discounts.
What's something interesting that's not on your CV?
I'm a massive Kate Bush fan. I have been known to dance in a red dress in the most Wuthering Heights day ever with thousands of other Kate Bush lookalikes in the past.
Okay, I'm going to have to Google that later. What advice would you give your 18-year-old self?
Stay true to yourself and trust your gut.
What book is a must-read?
A Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
What's a job for the future that doesn't exist today?
I think a lot of psychologists are going to specialise in screen addiction of those kids of ours of today who are going to grow into adults. And I'm wondering what the impact the screen time has on those kids. So I think potentially there'll be some psychologists that specialise in that.
Sarit, thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Our guest today was Sarit Vandergraaff, an exceptional organisational coach and facilitator who has worked with leaders across the globe. She's a Senior Associate Program Director and Executive Coach at TranExec, one of Australia's leading coaching and leadership development companies. Sarit is also a Senior Coach and Facilitator at Leadership Space, where their mission is to help social purpose leaders transform their organisation's effectiveness. You can connect with Sarit on LinkedIn.
Thanks for listening to the HR Think Tank with Kai No. We'd love it if you could subscribe and share our podcast with your network. As always, the resources and links mentioned will be included in the show notes and posted on the Verify Now website, verifynow.com.au.